Now that we are ready to use ES6 classes, let's take it one step further and implement inheritance between classes using subclasses. So, do you remember this slide from when we first talked about inheritance? We had this example where we had two function constructors, or ES6 classes, which is like the same thing, that can inherit from one another. So we have here the more generic class person for all persons, and then we have the more specific subclass for an athlete, because an athlete is also a person, but with some more specific attributes and also methods. And so it makes a lot of sense that we make the athlete class inherit from the person class, right? Now, we have actually never implemented this in our code up until this point. All we did was to make objects inherit methods from their prototype. But this inheritance between classes is really taking it even one step further, and so that's something really cool and sometimes really useful too. So, such as before, let me first show you how to do it in ES5, and then we move on to classes and subclasses with ES6. First of all, let's get back the code that we wrote before for ES5, so that we don't have to write it all over again. So this person5 function constructor, or let's call it class, will be our superclass. So let's now create the subclass, which will be the athlete class. And this is how we do it. So athlete and 5 again as a function, and in this function we actually have to pass in these exact same parameters here as well. So let's just copy them. Okay, so if you want an athlete, we need to say their name, their year of birth, their job, and we also want to define to how many Olympic Games they went. So let's call it Olympic Games. And also how many medals they have won. So medals. Okay, and now in this subclass, the first thing that we have to do is to call our superclass, which is person5, right? So let's do that, person5, and we actually now have to use the call method. And I'm going to explain you why in a second, okay? So let's first write the code, and then I'm going to explain it to you. So this will be set to this, and then we pass in the 3 arguments that we have. So name, year of birth, and the job. And we can only pass the 3 arguments into here because we received them in this function call here as well, right? And that's why we have to have them here and also in here. Okay? And now it works like just it worked before. So we say Olympic Games is equal to Olympic Games, of course, and this dot medals is medals. So why do we have to call the superclass function constructor with this as the this keyword? And I'll give you a second to pause the video and think about that. To explain this, we need to remember how the new operator works, which is the operator that we use to create a new instance. So when creating a new athlete object, new creates a new empty object, calls the athlete function constructor, and sets the this keyword to the newly created empty objects. So you remember that part, right? So in the execution context that we're in here, the this keyword will point to the new empty object. Now, if we want a person property's name, year, and job to be set on a new athlete object, then we need to call the person function constructor with the this keyword also set to our newly created athlete object, right? And that's exactly what we do here. So after this, all the properties will be set in the new athlete object that's created by the new operator. And that's why we need to call it here and to set the this variable to this. Alright, and now to create the correct prototype chain, we're going to use object.create. Because remember, object.create allows us to manually set the prototype of an object. And we want a prototype of the athlete to be the prototype of the person so that they become connected. So let's quickly do that and say athlete5.prototype object.create person5.prototype. And that's it. So now the two function constructors are connected and the prototype chain should work just fine. So let's actually take a look at that in the console. And so I'm going to create a new athlete here. And I'll say John athlete 5. So it's a new athlete called John. So remember, we have to set all of these properties that we would set on a person also on the athlete. So John, born in 1990. And now let's say that he's a swimmer, that he went to 3 Olympic Games where he won 10 medals. So quite a great athlete. And let's now reload this and take a look at John the athlete. Okay, so here we go. So we see all of our properties are defined here in the athlete, and we also see that our prototype is the person 5. And that means that the athlete 5 function constructor's prototype property is the same that person 5's prototype property. And so in here we have the prototype of person 5, and then of course we have to calculate age function here. And what this means is that the prototype chain works exactly in the way that I showed you in a section where we talked about all of this. So let's now test this. So I'm going to write John athlete dot calculate age. And if I now reload this, then we actually get this error here. All right. So something must be wrong here in this method. Okay. So let's take a look. New date. Okay, and here it is. So this of course is a method. So get full year is a method. And that's why it wasn't working probably. So let's try it again. And all right. So 26 is the age. And that once again worked because not only all the instances of person can now inherit this method, but also all of the instances of the athlete class can inherit this method. Because as we did here in this line, the athlete 5 class inherits from the person 5 class. So again, person 5 is the superclass and athlete 5 is the subclass. And of course we can also set methods on the prototype property of the athlete 5 function constructor. So let's do that. Dot prototype dot won a medal. So this is a method that's very specific only to the athletes, and so all the instances are going to inherit this method if they are athlete instances, of course. And the person instances, they will not inherit this method because it's only in the athlete 5 prototype property. So this method will very simply increase the medals of the athlete plus plus, so increase by 1, and then log it to the console. And so now we can also use this one here. Won a medal. So let's try it out. And we got an error saying that one medal is not a function. And that's because it actually has to be after we connect these two function constructors with this line of code here. So we first set the athlete 5 prototype property, and then we can add methods to that very prototype property. Okay, and so now it's going to work. And we see that he has 11 medals now. So we started with 10 and now we have 11. So let's now just take a final look at the object in the console. And so now we'll also find the one medal here in its prototype property, which is exactly what we did here. And then of course also the calculate age function here further down in the prototype chain. Great, so now you learned how to connect to function constructors in ES5. So let's now do the same thing in ES6. And so once again, first I'm going to get back this class. Okay, so this is for ES6, and this here is our person. Let's just get rid of this method that we don't want, and let's focus on what we need. So we have our super class here, and now comes the fun part where we create a subclass of the person. And this is actually way easier to do in ES6 with the ES6 classes than with the function constructors like I showed you before. So all we have to do is to say, once again, class, and this one is called athlete6, and then we just use the extends keyword. So we say that this class extends the person class. Okay, and so always in the subclass we need to say that it extends the superclass. And then we of course once again need our constructor. And remember, all classes need to have this very method. And then in the same fashion as we had to do before with function constructors, we have to repeat the person properties here if we also want them on our athlete. So name, year of birth, job, and now remember what we want to add here is Olympic Games and medals. Now what we did before was to then use in the subclass this call method to call the superclass with the this variable set to this. Now here in classes we have to do something similar, but it's also easier because all we have to do is say super, and this will then call the superclass. And we don't have to manually set any this variable or anything. Everything happens automatically behind the scenes and we don't have to take care of any of that. So of course we call the superclass using name, year of birth, and job. And that makes sense, right? Because these are the exact same parameters that we have in the constructor of that class. And now we just say this dot Olympic Games is equal to Olympic Games, and the medals are medals. And that's it. So let's also add our method here. And so it's the same code as we had before. So this dot medals will be incremented by 1 unit. And then let's just log it to the console. So let's use this class and create yet another John athlete. So John, born in 1990, he's a swimmer, went to 3 Olympic Games where he won 10 medals. And just to check that everything works the same, we're going to call the same methods that we called before. So John athlete 6 dot won a medal, and John athlete 6 dot calculate age. So let's check it out. And we have a bug. Super keyword is not expected here. So here it's not expected. So it's actually because this is misspelled. So constructor. Okay, so now it should work. And yeah, here we go. It now says that the age is not a number, but that happened because we also had this bug here that we had before. So if we fix this, then it's going to work here as well. So it gives us the same age and the same medals, so everything works the same. But if you take a close look at it, then you have to agree that it's way easier to write it this way here. So these two class definitions, than to write all of this here up. Just everything like this. And we have to add of this line of code here. And it all looks a bit strange. So I clearly prefer to do it the ES6 way, with the class definitions. All we need to make sure is that we really understand what happens behind the scenes and what prototypal inheritance is and how it works and why doing these classes like this works the way that it does. And just to show you once again that these classes are just synthetic sugar, let me show you these athletes here as well in the console. So to prove you again that they look the exact same way. So this is the functioning prototype chain in the way we did it before with athlete 5 and person 5, and then what we did right now. And so we see, if we make this bigger, that it's the exact same thing. So this prototype chain here is the exact same as this prototype chain. Alright, and so with these two final lectures about classes, you now truly understand everything that there is to know about prototypal inheritance in classes in both ES5 and also ES6, which is really great.